Breaking news. 20 miles from the Russian border is a town that is still trying to recover from Putin's Foss's bloody occupation. Yuri Bova, mayor of Trostianets, a small Ukrainian town located only 20 miles from the Russian border, recalls that no one in his town ever thought the Russians would actually invade. Trostianets, located in eastern Ukraine's Sumy region, had no Ukrainian troops defending it as Russian tanks rumbled across the border in the wee hours of the morning. Bova claims they did everything possible to halt the Russian advance. One column of invading vehicles was halted for 2 days as trees were felled onto the roads through the rolling hills and forests surrounding Trostianets. But alas, it wasn't adequate. We were wrong to assume that there would be no more than 4 or 5 armored vehicles. However, another column with over 100 vehicles was there instead, including up to 60 tanks and armored personnel carriers, 20 troop-carrying trucks, and fuel tankers, Bova says. The Russians rolled into Trostianets on the invasion's first day, ushering in a nightmare for the town's 21,000 residents. A month later, on March 27, when the town was finally liberated from Russian occupation, I heard about its plight. Much of the town was destroyed, 49 people were killed, and 13 others are presumed disappeared by the occupiers in the intervening weeks. Although I had no personal connections in Trostianets and was calling from another part of Ukraine, I did so anyway. A call to a number labeled Hotel Trostianets was answered by a friendly voice. Tetyana Shevchenko, who answered the phone, is the hotel's owner and has recently returned to her hometown. As she told me how the hotel had been completely destroyed, I could hear her choking back tears. Beds, furniture, and even doors were smashed, and everything movable had been stolen, including the televisions, refrigerators, and air conditioners. Tetyana felt fortunate despite witnessing the destruction of the business she and her husband had worked on for years. Many of their friends and neighbors had lost loved ones, and their homes had been reduced to charred rubble. A similar reluctance to give in to hopelessness was to spread like wildfire across Ukraine. More than 15 months into a war Moscow seemed sure would only last weeks, I was able to make it to Trostianets. The Hotel Trostianets stood out among the other charred and battered skeletons that lined the town's main street. The town was established in 1660, and its landmarks include churches with onion domes and a fortress surrounded by a whitewashed stone wall constructed in the middle of the 18th century. Russian occupiers placed heavy artillery inside, correctly anticipating that Ukrainian forces would not attempt to destroy a national monument. The building was spared by Ukrainian shelling, but it bears the marks of machine gun fire from the retreating Russians, who left behind a bile-filled farewell. Scars can be seen on every street. Most of the buildings, including the train station and the shops, restaurants, and residences that surrounded a large square and park, were destroyed by bombing. The park's surface is a mashup of asphalt and dirt. A Soviet T-34 tank from World War II stands sentinel atop a tall concrete pedestal. After being hit by shellfire, one of its treads now trails limply. The Russians took over the hotel and forced Tetyana to leave when they arrived. She claimed that they wasted no time in attempting to instill fear in the community by randomly beating and detaining residents. According to her, many men were stripped naked and made to stand in the street during the night during the winter. They terrorized the locals and ransacked stores. People were soon being rounded up and tortured. They did whatever they wanted in the basement of our train station, Tetyana continues. They knew we were scared of them, so they acted even more haughtily. They seemed to take pleasure in it. Tetyana claims that 2 married friends of hers were riding bikes when the Russians opened fire on them. Russians wouldn't let her body be moved for burial and she lay there until the Russians left. Tetyana is a political figure in her community. She led the election board there. She and her daughter escaped to western Ukraine in the middle of March because she was afraid the Russians would come for them. Both of their husbands had deserted and were serving in the Ukrainian armed forces. Using their savings and the assistance of the local authorities, Tetyana and her husband began repairing their hotel as soon as the Russians left. Tetyana flashes a knowing grin as she displays a photograph of the door to room 6, where Russian scrawls reveal the presence of a Russian commander. A museum dedicated to the town's occupation will include this door. There has been a shift in the battlefield situation. The border region not far from Trostianets has become the center of cross-border incursions by pro-Ukrainian forces, as Ukraine has been pressing a counter-offensive to take other territory occupied by Russia in the south and east. Partisans in Russia who want to cause trouble for President Putin have been responsible for the vast majority of these acts. Shelling and raids have also hit the Russian Belgorod region, which is located 2 to 3 hours drive from Trostianets in Russian territory. Nonetheless, guerrilla activity of its own kind occurred in Trostianets during the Russian occupation. Bova, the mayor, explains how things went down. Bova, a short, stocky man with a successful business background, was born in Trostianets. He has served as mayor of his town for 18 years after being elected as a councilman when he was just 24. The Ukrainian government had been warned by British and American intelligence that the Russians had compiled extensive lists of government officials, military and police officers, educators, social activists, businesspeople, and others they believed might aid in organizing resistance and were therefore marked for arrest or execution. Bova explains, "I had to choose between staying in my office and waiting to be arrested and taken away, or perhaps killed. That's completely insane. We only had 4 machine guns between all of us, and ammunition was running low. So there was no way to fight that." The Ukrainian 81st Brigade, which was operating nearby, contacted him and his comrades and asked for intel on the situation inside Trostianets. "They said that would be much more valuable than any fight we could have put up at that time," says Bova, who took command of the Territorial Volunteer Forces of Trostianets. While some Ukrainian partisans remained in Trostianets proper, Bova and the others conducted their operations from bases in the surrounding woods, where they ate and slept, as well as the location of their heavy weapons and armored vehicles. They also directed the fire of Ukrainian artillery at enemy positions in Russia. According to Ukrainian intelligence, a prominent Russian general was among those who perished in the initial stages of this invasion, and his body was found in Trostianets. The partisans' morale was boosted by Bova's 2 covert visits to the town. They attempted to free the city from the occupiers on March 21 of last year, along with regular Ukrainian forces. However, they withdrew after a fierce firefight. According to Bova, many Russians died, but a partisan did as well. But Ukrainian forces were closing in on the city, and on the night of March 27 the demoralized Russians, fearing they were being surrounded, fled across the border into Russia. Bova tells me that the Russians looted and destroyed the town's main administration building along with the rest of the public and community buildings. Everything was destroyed by the Russians. About 30 tank shells were fired into our main hospital 3 days before they left. They tore down homes on purpose as well. It was deliberate badness. Bova thinks the 13 disappeared, were tortured in the tunnels beneath the train station. As the Russians fled, 2 prisoners were discovered still alive in the basement. They described victims whose fingers were severed before they died of blood loss. Bova's face crumpled in pain as he recounted how his captors demanded to know where he was before they would stop beating him. Bova claims he has put in countless hours since the town was freed to restore Trostianets. Damage was done to or removal of utilities such as power, water, and heat. All of the town's fire trucks, ambulances, buses, and other mobile apparatus had been taken. He claimed the Russians looted everything from basic toolkits to advanced military equipment. Bova reached out to 130 organizations and groups from around the world, and they all expressed interest in assisting in the reconstruction of Trostianets, which he describes as a huge logistical puzzle. In addition, many people have pitched in, many of whom showed up unannounced with donations of money or supplies or even just to pitch in and help. He claims that, to return some semblance of normalcy, everything from food and clothing to medical equipment, emergency vehicles, and buses, had to be replaced. As a result, today there are no homeless people in Trostianets living under a tree, he says. There is a roof over everyone's head. However, that underlying tension remains. Being so close to the border means the enemy is always within striking distance. Bova plans to rebuild Trostianets with cutting-edge architecture from all over the world, with special attention paid to accommodating the needs of the elderly and the disabled and utilizing environmentally friendly, low-energy technologies.